Hello, my name is Carl Suddler, and I'm an assistant professor of history at Emory University here in Atlanta, and author of Presumed Criminal: Black Youth in the Justice System in Post-War New York. I want to take time today to welcome you all to tonight's exclusive look at IMDb's original series, Moment of Truth. This five-part series tells the never-before-seen story behind the murder of James Jordan. And now, a first look at Moment of Truth.
They were as close as any father and son could hope to be.
I'm lucky to be a part of what he is, what he stands for, and what he's doing right now.
This is the father of the most famous athlete on the planet, Michael Jordan. And on his 57th birthday, he was an unidentified dead man in the swamp in the middle of nowhere.
The body has been positively identified as Mr. James Jordan.
In North Carolina, you probably couldn't find a more famous family than the Jordans.
There was immense pressure to solve this case.
Police have charged 18-year-old Daniel Green and 18-year-old Larry Demery with first-degree murder.
They were paraded into the courthouse for the cameras. I mean, it looked like you were broadcasting the Super Bowl out there in the parking lot.
Anything you want to say to the Jordan family?
I didn't kill him.
Authorities say Jordan died of a single gunshot wound to the chest, but no blood was found in the car.
It couldn't have happened as described.
They did not find a bullet hole in the chest area of the shirt. And how is it suddenly there when this case comes to trial?
I'm trying to stop short of corruption, but maybe I shouldn't.
This case was complicated from the very beginning. There had been a history of racial injustice and law enforcement corruption in Robeson County.
It is not uncommon in Robeson County for innocent people to be charged just to close a case.
The jury didn't hear all the facts. There were people involved who did not want information revealed.
It's always the deputy that wins.
They start pitting them against each other.
I'm starting to believe he's telling the truth. You shot and killed Mr. Jordan.
He's wearing the dead man's jewelry. It doesn't look good.
Both of us kind of like pawns in a game.
There is still so many lingering mysteries to this case.
The hardest part is watching the people that you love suffer because they know that you're innocent. In this country, we have an expectation that freedom is a right, and it's not. Freedom is a privilege. I'm fighting for my freedom.
It's finally time that someone tells the truth.
Just want to introduce my fellow panelists and the film team to hear more about their connection to the project and speak to the appeal work that the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence is putting in motion for Daniel Green. If I can start with you, Matt, just a quick, brief introduction and your connection to the film.
I grew up in North Carolina, and this is a case that I've known about since I was 13 years old when the crime happened. And it's, growing up in North Carolina, it's kind of one of those seminal moments. It was reported on in the news in far greater detail and much more volume than it was ever reported on a national level. It was reported on every day for years. And so there was an awareness about this project that I had. And when the opportunity to dive deeper into this story presented itself and work on this project, it was something that I knew that I had to be a part of. There's a lot of questions that were unanswered, and we wanted to create a complete view of all sides of this story, a definitive telling of the story to the best of our ability, and also look at a lot of the new evidence that has been uncovered over the past few decades. I think a lot of times people move on once there's a verdict, but I think when there's questions of fact, we have to re-examine those things.
Yeah, for sure. And I can't wait to talk a little bit more with you here in a second. Shelly, quick introduction.
Yes, hi, I'm the head of original programming for Capital Broadcasting Company and executive producer on Moment of Truth. And growing up in North Carolina, like Matt, I've lived this case since 1993 when it happened. And I was a young photojournalist at WRL TV at the time. And our television station has covered this story for 27 years. So we have this deep archive on the case. And that really led us to look at whether the full story had been told. And we decided to pursue the docuseries in 2016 when Chris and the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence got involved in Daniel's case. It really got a lot of people's attention including ours.
Okay. Yeah. Jule, quick introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jule Hall. I'm calling in from New York City. This is a powerful film. I'm just so grateful to be part of this panel, having this very important discussion.
Yeah. Dyjuan, quick introduction.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dyjuan Tatro. I'm an alumnus of the Bard Prison Initiative, a formerly incarcerated person. I work at the state, federal, and municipal levels to enact sweeping criminal justice reforms. I'm the government affairs officer at the Bard Prison Initiative and also senior advisor of strategic outreach at the DCCC.
Thank you. And finally, Chris, introduction.
Thank you. My name is Chris Mumma. I represent Daniel. Great honor of representing Daniel Green. I've been his attorney for over 4 years now, and I'm the executive director of the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence, which represents innocent people in prison, and we also advocate for reform in the criminal justice system.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation, for the mix of people that we have in this room. I'd like to start the discussion this evening, however, with the docuseries and how it came to being. And so, Shelly, I'm going to come back to you. You were involved with this project very early on, as you mentioned briefly. So how did you come to the decision to make this into a documentary series?
Well, I think, as we covered the story for 27 years, we were very close to it and had this deep archive on the case. And again, when Chris and her team got involved and new information started emerging and more questions began being raised about what really happened, we realized the case really needed a more thorough examination, and that we could tell this story in a way that no one else really could because of our history of reporting on it. We began work on this series in 2018 with a goal of really telling the whole of it, all sides from a journalistic search for the truth, and to really ask the question, did correct justice really occur in this case?
And so with that, I mean, just a kind of a quick follow-up. And, I often think about the different means of media, right, to get these types of stories out. And so, I mean, docuseries have a particular type of like punch, right, especially with general audience, right? Because you can flood people's outlets with stuff on paper, right? You can tell you read this, but it's different when you have it, captured in film. And so, and I'll use this kind of as a follow-up, but also to get us to segue into Matt as well. But the docuseries as a format, you felt it was needed, right?
Well, yes, this is a really complex story, and it's an emotional story. And when you read about something, you internalize that and you have thoughts about it. But when you listen to Daniel's voice, for example, this is really the first time Daniel's side of this has been told, because he didn't testify at trial, so we didn't hear from him. When you hear the trial audio for the first time, you are sitting in the courtroom hearing that actual trial occur. You hear the interrogation. So as a listener and as a viewer, you can feel what those situations might have been like, I think, in a more powerful way than if you read about it.
And so, yeah, so I'm gonna use that to segue to you, Matt. And so when developing this series, a lot of us think of these as sort of like aha moments, right? Like, was there an aha moment when reviewing Daniel's story? And if so, how did that shape your vision for the series and how it came together?
I would say there were many of those moments over the course of creating this series. As Shelly mentioned, the project began in 2018, and when the project began in 2018, it was, the story is still evolving. The story is still evolving today. There were moments where we would wake up in the morning and, new news would come out, or, Chris would have uncovered something, a new piece of information. And to tell the story in a complete way, like I said, those revelations happen on a regular basis, and we went through, over 8,000 pages of court trial transcript. And, you read these documents, and we actually had the trial transcript before we had the audio. This, as Shelly mentioned, this is the first time the trial audio will ever be heard publicly. It had never been digitized for a project prior to this. And because of COVID, we couldn't get that audio until the last summer. So we were actually working off of the paper documents to find the pieces of the story from the trial that we wanted to include in the series. And you would read some of the statements that were made and some of the things that took place in this trial, and it just was shocking. Some of the things you saw were shocking, and many of those we include in the series. But for us, it was always about objectively telling all sides of this. I think one of the things about this case is it's fallen into conspiracy theory and mystery, and that's because the facts didn't make sense. And we as human beings, when facts don't make sense, we try to fill those gaps. And people tried to fill those gaps with ultimately going down these rabbit holes of false narratives. But we wanted to look at the evidence and then look at those facts and tell all sides of the story, including Daniel's, which hasn't been told completely. And we also wanted to approach telling the story with a degree of humanity that's never been applied to the story. These are real people's lives that were forever altered. And that's something that I think a lot of true crime projects forget. You know, it's all about the kind of, you know, salacious nature sometimes when you're telling these stories. And for us, it was really about tapping into who are these individuals as on a human level, because that's not done as often as it should be.
And so with that, from a filmmaking perspective, were there, well, I mean, I don't want to say were there barriers. I feel like that's almost a, you know, a given that there were some sort of barriers in the process. But, you know, what kinds of barriers come up in developing a docuseries like this that, you know, the team was able to kind of overcome to put this together?
Well, there were a number of barriers in the creation of this series. I think there's a lot of information that, you know, has been obscured over time. And then there's also new information that has come out. You know, we wanted to conduct an additional interview with Daniel in prison. The Department of Corrections originally told us that we wouldn't be able to do that. That's something that, you know, was unexpected. You know, and then once COVID set in, the prison system was shut down completely, and that became not an option. So we had to rely on, you know, luckily WRAL has extensively covered this, and there was a deep archive of footage, but we had to rely on interviews that they had conducted with Daniel in the past. You know, and then a series of audio interviews post-COVID to kind of allow Daniel to tell his story in his own words. One of the things that's really interesting about this is we actually edited the majority of the series virtually. We were about just finished with the first episode when we had to close our offices down because of the pandemic, and we had to shut, you know, everything was done virtually. That was the first for all of us on the filmmaking team, having to edit and be creative and figure out how to structure a story. And it's a very complicated story, and how to do that over Zoom effectively. So there were new techniques and all kinds of things to overcome throughout the process from a filmmaking standpoint.
Yeah, I can imagine. You know, again, just thinking about all of us and the adjustments to Zoom world. I mean, making a docuseries as powerful as this, I can imagine what type of, you know, technical gaps happened along the way for sure. As we transition a bit, you know, to Jule and Dyjuan, I'm gonna start with you, Jule. Formerly incarcerated at a young age, changes dramatically the trajectory of your life. I'm interested in your reaction to Daniel's story. How does it, you know, resonate?
It resonates deeply. There's one thing I want to bring attention to. We should really think about the context in which a lot of things were occurring in the late 80s and in the early 90s in America. We had a narrative of young Black boys being considered super predators. We had, you know, from my personal perspective, we had the influx of guns in communities where there were no gun manufacturers. We had drugs flooding into these communities. You know, James Johnson discusses in the clip we just saw, the structural problems that played into a lot of the things that occurred in Daniel Green's life. it resonates with me for that simple fact. One thing that I would like to also bring attention to is that when we deal with these type of projects, there's a tendency, and I think this is an American thing, we focus on the individual, but we are people in a larger context. So it's important to recognize both the structural. I know for me, when I was incarcerated, I went through this deep self-criticism. I took responsibility for not only things that I did, but things that I didn't do, because the narrative had impressed upon me so much that I might be just that. But what's so important about the work that Matt and Shelly has done is that now we have the chance to investigate and reshape that narrative. This film and other films like it are reshaping the narrative. Here you have Daniel Green was a bright young man in school, but the narrative at the time was that young Black men and women were not redeemable and weren't, we got to point to the school system as well as the legal system, because the school system also made us feel as if we were inadequate and couldn't be able to achieve through education. So it resonates, it resonates with me on all those levels. I would like to bring attention to the fact that, while I served time and got a great education with the Bard Prison Initiative, I am now a program officer doing that work of funding college programs in prison. And my company, companies like it, and the government, we have to recognize that Pell Grants has been reinstated for incarcerated learners. This is also shifting the narrative to say, wait, we may have had it wrong. There are people here who are worth contributing to society and able to be a benefit to everyone. So I know that's a lot. I want to leave room for more questions, but it just resonates with me on the most individual level to the more contextual and structural level as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment there, Jule. And Dyjuan, I'm coming right to you with the next one. I mean, we see in the series, Daniel Green coped with his years of incarceration, and even in the clip, by studying, by learning, right? And I know Jule just mentioned, BPI, just thinking about how important education is for incarcerated communities as sort of an outlet. Can you speak or shed a little light on it as well from your experience?
Yeah, Carl, and give me a second to get there. But first, I just want to point out, go back to something, that Matt and Shelly pointed to, and it's kind of like, they're using this film as a medium to introduce us to Daniel Green for the first time. I grew up in the early 90s. I'm a Michael Jordan fan. And when this incident occurred, all you heard was this huge tragedy around Michael Jordan, this tragedy around his family. We didn't hear about the tragedy of Michael Green's life, right? And how this event impacted him. And so for me, as someone who spent 12 years in prison and have been called all different types of things, when I watch that clip and see the prosecutor, labeled Daniel as vicious and mean, but then we get to meet Daniel, and he's this extremely articulate, thoughtful individual who's reflecting on a complicated history. And his part in this tragedy, we experience him in a different way that's in contrast to the typical caricatures and stereotypes around incarcerated people, right? And we see Daniel, aspiring in the film to educate himself while incarcerated. I'm someone who got an education in prison, finished that post-release. This was about 3.5 years ago, got out, finished the education, went to work on campaigns here in New York, went to do government affairs at the Bard Prison Initiative, and now just got a big job in DC working on campaigns nationally, going to do some things in the criminal justice space, right? I'm someone who was once irredeemable, right? I'm someone who wants society writ off. And what we see in Daniel Green in that clip is that we need to rethink not only what happened to him in his case. We can't leave Daniel Green sitting in prison just because his case was high profile, right? there's as Jule pointed to, there's a bigger context and bigger structures at force here. And if we can address, the injustices around Daniel Green, there's a whole bunch of other young Black and brown men in prison all over this country who have gone to prison out of a complicated set of circumstances, who, as Jule just mentioned, Pell's been restored, are going to have, access to education in prison, who are going to be able to return to society and be contributors in this democracy, right? Be productive citizens. We really have to question whether or not we benefit as a society from Daniel Green sitting in prison, right? I did 12 years in prison. I get up every day to make the world a better place, right? Jule does the same thing, and countless other people like us. And I think Daniel Green can also.
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, I think you just threw the softball to Chris, and the question there to get Chris involved here. So Chris, I mean, a new appeal is being filed on behalf of Daniel Green. And as the filmmakers both made nod to, this is a story that's evolving every day. I mean, so what's the latest? How are things going? What is kind of your hope that this film is able to kind of put forward and change the narrative?
Well, I think getting the narrative out there, and I appreciate all the comments have been made with regard to Daniel and people understanding Daniel and the change in the narrative about who Daniel is, because that's not who he is at all. I can't thank Shelly and Matt enough for taking on this project, not just for Daniel, but for the education of everybody out there on how narratives change our perceptions of reality, and they're false narratives. The appeal is just another step in the battle. This is a series of battles in the war to try and gain somebody's freedom. And the battles are hard. And we originally had, when the judge denied Daniel an evidentiary hearing, and I got to tell you, I was completely shocked. I made the serious mistake of telling Daniel that I had no doubt that he was going to get an evidentiary hearing, and I didn't. I truly believed there was no way he wouldn't, and he believed me, and that turned out to be a horrible thing. But the appeal was originally being handled by the appellate defender's office, and then we decided that we had too much knowledge about Daniel. We had too much knowledge about the case to have another office handle the appeal. So I actually hired somebody so that they could help with the appellate process, because I think the historical institutional knowledge of Daniel in the case is so important to bring in as we respond to this 83-page order from the judge. So we're still working on that. People keep asking, when is it going to be filed? When is it going to be filed? And it's going to be filed when it's perfect, because Daniel deserves that.
I mean, on that note, right, like, as I think we all kind of are nodding to here, both the formulation of questions, but also the formulation of answers, well, like, this is a particular story about Daniel Green, right? But this has much broader ramifications, right, on tons of incarcerated people, in particular Black and brown men here, right, who see themselves in Daniel Green, and not only themselves in their own stories, but when we also think about wrongful convictions, right, and the impact of wrongful convictions on various incarcerated communities. So Chris, I'm sorry to come back to you with another question here, but you have a track record overturning wrongful convictions, working with groups like North Carolina Actual Innocence. Like, can you speak a bit on on how wrongful convictions, like how do they continue to persist, right? So if you're just kind of I think a lot about wrongful convictions as well, and I'll give a short kind of backdrop of who I am, right? Like, so I'm a scholar and a historian and write about a lot of this stuff. But I also try to get as involved in community-oriented research as possible. And Georgia Innocence Project is another one, right? You know, here in Georgia, but particularly in Atlanta. And you know, but when I have conversations with students about like why there is a need for organizations like the Georgia Innocence Project or like the North Carolina Actual Innocence, the first reaction is, you know, are there that many wrongful convictions? And my response is often yes. But you know, from a legal standpoint, you know, from the attorney standpoint, how would you respond to someone who asks you a question about like why is there such a need for wrongful convictions?
Well, let me start with response to you saying I have a track record of overturning wrongful convictions. That's not my track record. My track record is a track record of representing innocent people. You know, and so there's a difference. This is not about me. This is about people who were wrongfully convicted and incarcerated in the justice system, which is so focused on finality and so convinced that we get it right every time that it's unwilling to turn and look back. Even when we learn things about science and we learn things about race and we learn things about investigations and tunnel vision, even when we're learning all those things, we're not willing to take what we've learned and go back and see what we did before and make sure we did it right. I think if you looked at any case from 25, 30 years ago, you're going to see problems. Even if the person's guilty, you're going to see problems. So it's not, I think in the wrongful conviction groups, the people who work on these cases, we focus on the felony cases because those are the people who are in prison and are suffering a kind of tragedy that I can never imagine anything that's worse. But people who are convicted of misdemeanors, there's a higher percentage of wrongful convictions and misdemeanors than felonies, I'm convinced, because people need to be able to move on with their lives and get back to their jobs. But those cases are completely, nobody ever looks at those. But the collateral consequences of someone having that type of conviction can be extensive. So we have a lot to learn from the past, and we don't do a very good job of applying that in the justice system.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to acknowledge a wrongdoing, right? Not only a wrongdoing, but to also accept the fact that, you know, there are still people in these positions of power and positions of authority who may have made the wrong decision, right? You know, that takes responsibility and a particular type of onus, certainly. So just a quick reminder to those in the audience, please use the Q&A function. We're gonna start pulling some questions here from audience that are directed at different panelists, but also just to kind of throw them out there. So keep those coming in. We have an eye on the chat and the clock here. So I'm gonna kind of work my way back around to the filmmakers here for a second, if I can. Is there an end goal when making a film like this or making a docuseries like this? You know, so we like to think it's about getting the story out, getting the you know, facts presented, getting, you know, and having an effective response. But there also seems like these are the type of films designed to inspire, right? To inspire people to want to kind of you know, pick up the mantle, if you will. Does that go into the filmmaking process? And if so, how? And, you know, I'll go Matt or Shelly, Matt and Shelly, whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, you know, look, I think with this case, most cases, and we've alluded to this in this conversation, are not as documented as this case it has been. This case was very well documented because of the high profile nature of it. And because of that, we realized very early on that this case can operate as a gateway into those larger conversations that we as a society need to be having right now. And we should have been having for a very long time. The fact that this crime took place almost 28 years ago, the trial was 25 years ago, and we are still seeing and coping with as a society and encountering the same issues. And it's, you know, as everyone said, mostly Black and brown men keep having the same systemic racism against them over and over again. We knew that this case could operate as that gateway. And we knew therefore that it is something that had the potential to inspire people and to create a larger public conversation. As far as when a documentary ends, you don't know. There's a big piece of information. I don't want to, spoil everything for viewers. The show comes out tomorrow, so we want people to experience this on their own and come to their own determinations based on all of these facts that we lay out. But there was a huge piece of information that dropped at the end of last summer, and it was shocking to all of us. And that was something that we didn't foresee coming, and it alters the narrative. It alters of that you're telling, not the overall narrative of what the series is, but it alters that moment because all of a sudden there's a new dimension to it. So with documentary, you are always continuing to follow the story. And I think that's why in many cases, when there have been new developments in stories, specifically stories such as this, you end up seeing additional, whether it's additional films made or additional episodes of a series made to complete those stories if there's more to tell. But with this story, we unfortunately knew when we were doing the edit where Daniel's case was and that the courts were refusing to hear the case. And so we knew that we were going to ultimately be ending in that place when we completed.
Shelly, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think the entry point for most people is that this is a true crime story, but I would say it's every much as a social justice story. And the very conversation that we're having right now, this meaningful, important conversation about the structural things that are in place that have this happen. And as Matt said, on cases, how many of these cases are out there that aren't documented, that aren't high profile? And if this, wasn't about James Jordan, sadly, would there be as much interest in this case if it didn't have that celebrity, element to it? But I think obviously the story's not over, and I think it deserves this level of re-examination, and I hope people are moved by that, and I hope it expands the dialogue in the way that we're expanding it right now about, is there equal justice in the justice system? And how often do we get it right? And as Chris so greatly said, how often are we actually willing to stop and take self-reflection and look and see if we didn't get it wrong? If we got it wrong, are we willing to actually say that?
Yeah, it's so important for progress to be made, right? Is that admission. So we have a couple questions here in the chat. I'm gonna take this first question from Cooper Miller for Chris. I'm assuming it was for Chris. It's tied to the legal process. This person asks, how common is the type of plea deal that Larry used that was mentioned in the film or in the clip of the film?
Unfortunately, it's very common. I think his plea deal was very favorable. There were a lot of charges that were condensed into the 40-year sentence, but the approach of putting different people who are suspected of being involved in different rooms and pitting them against each other with threats of the death penalty, with threats to their families, and seeing who they can break first. It's not about getting to the truth, and you can tell that when you listen or read the interrogations. It's about moving the investigation along, and let's see how hard we can push so we can get some evidence and convict somebody here.
Yeah, okay. So now it's one of those things. Once we open the floodgates to questions from the audience, there were like none, and then they all come in at one time. But this is great. I'm gonna try to squeeze and pair them in as much as we can. Matt, there's like I'm gonna toss two of these to you here in a combined question that starts with, what was the most absurd conspiracy that you debunked in this process? In one of your earlier responses, you brought up conspiracies there. But then there was also a question on Larry Demery's backstory. And what did you learn about Larry Demery's backstory? he's getting a chance for parole in 2023. Why not spend more time on him?
Yes. Well, let me tackle the first one about conspiracy theories. I think conspiracy theories around this case started almost immediately. Like I said, I think when facts don't add up and facts don't fully make sense, people try to rationalize that inside of themselves, and that leads sometimes to creating false narratives. I think that's what happened in this case, and I think that happened actually at the media level. I think you started seeing a lot of journalists at the time trying to tie this into other aspects of the Jordan family, Michael Jordan's life. We knew very early on that any tie to the Michael or the Jordan family was not factual, was not true. And so I think that's probably the biggest conspiracy theory that has kind of clouded this case for so many years, is that, oh, they said James Jordan was shot, and there had to be something else behind why he was shot. And the fact is, there are discrepancies that versus the public narrative. And that's what we wanted to explore. But that conspiracy theory, we realized very early on, it was not tied to any, anything related to the family or anything like that. And then I think as far as the second question is Larry Demery, we as a team, as a filmmaking team, and this was a filmmaking team that made this. I think, it needs to be said very clearly. Clay Johnson, who co-directed the first 2 episodes with me, and we wrote and produced the series. Clay's an amazing journalist and documentarian who works with WRAL. Jay Jennings, Dave Guthrie were the 2 editors. Jay was also one of the cinematographers, and Cliff Baumgartner, led in the team by Shelly, and executive producers with Jimmy Goodman, Michael Sherman, and Kelsey Olick on the producing team. So it was really a team effort that made this. Larry was reached out to early in the process, and as everyone, as many people were, that we wanted to reach out to and talk to. In North Carolina, you have to write a letter to an inmate, and they have to respond, and Larry ultimately declined. But we also felt Larry had his day in court. Larry testified, and Larry actually provided multiple statements over the years to law enforcement. One of the elements that we look at in this case is that those statements changed. Details changed over the course of those statements, over the course of 3 years, from the initial statement that was given to the statement that was provided at trial as testimony. And Daniel did not testify at trial. So Daniel's voice and his version of the events surrounding this crime were never said in a public court. So we felt that Larry has made those statements and had his day in court to make those statements. Daniel had not. So we used the statements that Larry made, and that's the version that represents his voice in this.
Can I comment additionally on Larry, if you don't mind? I agree with the things that Matt has said, but I also think, and I say in the film, we don't know what happened, and I think the only person that really knows what happened is Larry. But I also think Larry was faced with some of the same things that Daniel was faced with. He was faced with the pressure and the fear, and he was very young. I think there's people out there who are a lot older and a lot more involved in things that know exactly what happened. And Larry was a fall guy who also implicated Daniel, but I think there's a story for Larry as well. I just don't, this is not the forum for that. And I hope he will come forward, and I've written him and said, please let me help you too. But that has to be Larry's call.
Yeah, I think Chris said it amazingly well. I think, you see it very early in the series, the interrogation scene, and you see how these 2 teenage boys are being best friends, are being pitted against one another, and it's horrifying in many ways. And it doesn't look or sound the way that we think justice is supposed to. Yeah. And we wanted to show that. So yes, I didn't want my comments to be misconstrued. Larry is, I think one of the things that we talk about is these are systemic issues. That's what this series points to. And these 2 teenagers were sent to jail for the rest of their lives as being a product of this system that failed them in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one more question here from the audience I want to get out to Dyjuan and Jule, time permitting. We talk a lot about narratives, right? Even to like in this group, right? And amongst each other, we've been talking so much about narratives. Um, can you both? I'll start with you, Dyjuan. Just kind of share like about the work on narrative changing. How can we be active in making these types of impactful changes in the way that we talk about and think about and work with incarcerated people?
You know, one of the big ways for me has just been leading by example. You know, I knew while I was incarcerated that I was in a very privileged position to get an education. So the day I walked out of prison, I decided that, you know, I needed to take that privilege and use it to make change in the world, because I was going to be able to get into rooms, into places before people that other formerly incarcerated people who didn't have degrees were not, right? And overwhelmingly, you know, what we've done at the Barred Prison Initiative for the past 20 years is really defied expectation of who college is for and and where it might lead, right? We get individuals who walk out of prison after 10, 15, 20 years and into graduate degree programs, PhD programs at, you know, some of the Ivy League universities and big name universities all over the country, right? And so really leading by example, we've been able to change the narrative and push back against the stereotypes and caricatures that are wielded against incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. And Carl, I'll also add, just on the note of, you know, where we are today in the criminal justice space versus where we are when Daniel went to prison. You know, in 2012, Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't incarcerate a youth for life without parole, right? Over the past 10 years, in South Carolina included, we've raised the age on convictions, right? And so when we see in the film that Daniel is incarcerated at a very young age for that first crime, that wouldn't have happened today, right? And so one of the pushes that, you know, we've been making across the criminal justice space is to make these type of changes retroactive to fix some of these past injustices. And so this film, you know, can really be used to change the narrative and flesh out for us what those injustices are in the past and how we can change them today, right? Some of the things that we've already fixed, we just need to apply to people who have been previously incarcerated. Today, we know better and we should be treating people better.
And I would just add quickly, what Shelly and Matt are doing is changing the narrative. We also need people to get proximate in the sense of Brian Stevenson in any way or form that you can. Whether you're going into a prison to teach, whether you're going to visit someone. But there's one other thing that I think that was relevant to this discussion. We need to start asking the right questions. It's not about Larry, it's not about Daniel. It's about the system that put them in a situation to be pitted against each other. So one way we could change the narrative is start asking the questions about what is this system? How does it operate?
And I think, you know, again, I think it's so important that, you know, films like this, experiences like this, stories like this, conversations like these continue to take place, and, you know, and people continue to be vested in them for us to see the type of change that we all want to see. I am sorry, there are still questions in the chat, but we are out of time, and I am very cognizant of people's time. What I will say is I want to thank you all for joining us today for the exclusive look at the Moment of Truth series and discussion. There are ways that you can all take action and spread awareness about Daniel Green's story and his appeal. You can visit the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence website to learn more, or share that the release of this series is starting tomorrow, April 2nd, on IMDb TV, Amazon's premier free streaming service. So I want to thank my panelists for the conversation. Thank you for putting this film together. Thank you for taking time out of your Thursday evening to share some insight with it as well. And yeah, and thank you all in the audience for coming on out tonight.